This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. You are listening to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Shaonta Allen. Shaonta Allen is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Dartmouth College. She also holds affiliations with the African and African American Studies Department and the Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality. She received her BA in Sociology from the University of Washington, her MA in Sociology, and a graduate certificate in Women and Gender Studies from Middle Tennessee State University, and her PhD in Sociology from the University of Cincinnati. In this episode, we discuss her current book project that examines the experiences of Black Christian Millennials during Black Lives Matter, and an article titled, Is the Black Church Dead? Religious Resilience and the Contemporary Functions of Black Christianity, from the journal Religions. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Shaonta Allen. Dr. Shaonta Allen, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So again, my name is Dr. Shaonta Allen. I am currently an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Dartmouth College, and I'm also an affiliate of the African and African American Studies Department. As a sociologist, I draw on literatures in many different fields to study the ways Black communities cultivate political ideologies and translate those political thoughts into political behaviors and political actions. And I'm particularly fascinated in the role that the Black church, Black faith, and Black spirituality has informed those processes over time and in the present moment.
Wonderful. I'm always curious about guests' backstories and how they got interested in the topics that they have gone on to make careers out of studying. Can you tell me a little bit about some of like the major turning points along the way that led to your interest in going down this path within sociology that led to the expertises that you have today?
Yeah, there was a couple of moments that immediately come to mind. So I'm probably rare for my colleagues in sociology in that I've been a sociology major since literally the first day of college. I
Nice.
took Sociology 101 my fall term of my freshman year. And the reason why sociology resonated with me so well is because the instructor taught it around 4 subtopics, which were race, religion, education, and then like globalization. And as a first generation to college student, a large component of my identity was that I was a Black girl from Washington State who was Christian and who was really smart. And so, the fact that 3/4 of that class really allowed me to see myself in the literature and to just learn about my own identities in this new way, I was really captivated by the field of sociology from the very, again, first class I took in college and decided to major in it. I was a double major with African American studies, so I always was really grounded in race. But I think my curiosity about religion and religious identities, that seed was planted very early on too. I didn't know that it would blossom in the way that it has, but it was there. And so I went on to do my master's degree. And when I was transitioning from my master's degree into my PhD, the Black Lives Matter movement was coalescing. And I was engaged with some local activism as a master's student, but right as I was moving to the University of Cincinnati to start my PhD program, the University of Cincinnati's police officer had killed a local Black man, literally weeks before I started my PhD program. So literally, I'm starting my PhD program thinking about what kind of sociological questions are fascinating to me, and the Black Lives Matter movement is happening literally outside of my building. The sociology
Wow.
department was really involved with some of the teach-ins that were being held on campus and with local community members. And so Black Lives Matter became a really pivotal topic and movement of interest for me. And then it was Brittany Cooper, actually, at Rutgers, came to the Cincinnati to give a talk on the Say Her Name movement, which, as we know, is a sub-movement of Black Lives Matter, or an affiliate movement of Black Lives Matter, that kind of has drawn attention to the lack of news media coverage of women and trans women who have been killed by the police. For some reason, we started to notice this trend that the narratives and the cases that were getting really high profile coverage tended to be young Black men, but there were just as many, Black women and trans women who were also being harmed and killed by police. And for some reason, those narratives just were not getting the same traction as some of these other stories. And so the Say Her Name's affiliate movement draws attention to that. And so during her Q&A, she got a question, Brittany Cooper got a question after her lecture, and the question asked her, like, what did she think the role of the church was in the movement? And she could kind of ascertain pretty quickly that the person didn't really ask that question in good faith. It was kind of asked in a way expecting her to say, oh, the church isn't doing what it used to do, like in the civil rights movement. But she totally didn't take the bait and said, anybody who's trying to convince you that you can't understand the Black Lives Matter movement through a Christian lens or see the ways that churches and pastors are supporting the movement, it's just lazy thinking. And so she kind of broke that down, and that became super fascinating to me. And I started to think, okay, I know how I, as a Black Christian millennial, am making sense of the Black Lives Matter movement and the ways that faith and spirituality are showing up. But I'm really curious now what other people would say, because I just heard what Brittany Cooper said, and now, I'm really fascinated at that. And that actually became the sociological imagination moment, if you will, that led to my dissertation project, which is now my book project on Black Christian millennials and how they're reconciling the tensions between their racial identities and religious politics during Black Lives Matter.
How is the book adaptation process going on that dissertation?
It's going good. I had interviewed 65 Black Christian millennials to, again, talk about the ways that their race, faith, and politics overlap, intersect, and sometimes come into tension with one another. And again, I think it's important because for some reason, people have created these ideas that religion is becoming insignificant. And I know we might talk about that a little bit more later. And so I think that my demographic of study, these Black Christian millennials, demonstrate and illustrate the very intricate ways that religion and politics have always intersected. We've got a lot of stuff going on in our own country with our local election revving up, and we know the ways that religion is leveraged in particular ways to garner votes. We've got a lot of stuff happening internationally from post-October 7th to the present day with the student protests with regards to Palestinian liberation. We have so much to look at as examples of how religion and politics are literally inseparable. And so I think all of this, both domestic and international context, lays really fertile ground for my study, again, to examine and dissect the ways that many groups, particularly communities of color, have always drawn on their faith when thinking about their liberation struggles.
When we were first in touch, you sent me some reading. It's called Is the Black Church Dead? Religious Resilience and the Contemporary Functions of Black Christianity. Tell me a little bit about the origin of this piece.
Yeah, so as a trained sociologist, and as any field or scholar would do, you have to situate your research in ongoing scholarly conversations. And within the sociology field of subfield of religion, there's a lot of emphasis on disaffiliation right now, on secularization. And so critiques of the Black church have suggested that it's just not the same political institution that it once was. And this colloquial phrase that the Black church is dead or that the Black church is dying is pretty commonly used, and you'll see it on social media alongside lots of users comments on why they no longer go to church, why they no longer find the church to be a safe space for them. And so that to me was really fascinating. When I first started my research project, I assumed that most of my participants would not go to church just because, again, this tends to be the dominant rhetoric in social media. But I was shocked to find that over 65% of my participants reported yes to having a home church. So I said, there's something really fascinating here. I mean, there's the broader just trends in the religious like marketplace, if you will, that we're seeing declines in church attendance. We're seeing declines in people reporting like having faith or believing in God. However, at the same time, when you disaggregate these findings by race, we see that numbers are still above the like national averages when you look at the Black community. And the Black community has always been a very highly religious community. So I wanted to kind of interrogate, is the Black church really dead? And how can we go about empirically like measuring this? So I'm doing a lot of research on the history of the Black church. You'll quickly find that the Black church was never just a religious institution for Black people. As a result of racism, Jim Crow segregation, amongst other, social processes of exclusion, like Black Americans needed to rely on the one institution they had access to and control of to be more than just their religious safe space. So the Black church historically served as daycares and primary schools. The Black church served as the first Black banks and mutual aid societies. The Black church is home to and has ties to many HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, have origins in quote unquote the basements of Black churches. Many Black Greek letter organizations use Black churches to do their community organizing. And then, of course, many of us are aware of the central role the Black church played in the civil rights movement. So here we can see that the Black church served as a political institution, an economic institution, a cultural institution. Again, many of our genres of music have origins and connections to traditions from gospel music. And so, again, we see that it really became the birthplace of Black American culture. And so I wanted to examine, what the literature says about the Black church and juxtapose that to what the Black millennials I had conversations with, how they're talking about the Black church today, to see where are the overlaps. Are there any things that they're no longer talking about? Are there new things that they're talking about that the literature didn't really cover? And so that became the quasi-experimental design that is this study, Is the Black Church Dead?
Wonderful. I'm curious about the sample size, methodology, where your participants live in the country. Anything that you can tell me about like the organization and the actual participants would be awesome.
Yeah, so again, this study is a qualitative project. It's based on in-depth interviews with 65 Black Christian millennials throughout the United States. It was funny when I first put out the call for this study, I was shocked because I got over 75 respondents within the first 2 days. And
Nice.
I wasn't even able to interview them all because I just didn't have the time. I also had interest from people in other countries. I had Black Christian millennials from Canada. I had Black Christian millennials from the UK reaching out saying, would you be interested in talking to me? And so this in itself told me, oh, this is an entirely untapped area, because why are there so many people? Like, to me, that was affirmation that racialized religious communities have a lot to say, and for some reason people aren't actually asking them or giving them the space to talk about it themselves. So that was really fascinating and eye-opening to me, that there's a lot of work and research that needs to be done so that these communities' experiences can be shared and elevated. But yeah, I did go ahead and limit my sample to just the United States. However, I was open to ethnic diversity. And this has been a hot topic in the media right now, as people have been trying to figure out whether or not Kamala Harris is Black American.
Right.
But I opened up my sample to Black Americans who are descendants of American slavery, which is the bulk of the sample. But I also do have some biracial and multiracial individuals in the sample. I have some Caribbean immigrants in the sample, and I have some African immigrants in the sample as well. While some might argue like, oh, well, isn't the experience of the Caribbean respondents or the African respondents may be slightly different from somebody who's born and raised in America their entire lives, even though some of those immigrants are second generation, so they were also born and raised in America. But when it comes to them being able to speak on their experiences with racialized religion, I figured they are just as equipped to talk about the way the potential conflict between their racial identity and their religious politics, because most of those countries also got Christianity through colonization in the same ways that Black Americans got Christianity through colonization. So thinking particularly about the potential tensions, they have similar experiences. And so therefore I felt like they would be a good fit for the study. And so I did not limit the sample to any specific region. So while most of my respondents are located in the Midwest and the South, I did also garner some responses from participants who were residing in the West Coast and the East Coast as well. And again, I kind of wanted to see, we know that the South is considered the Bible Belt. We know that through the Great Migration, many Black people took that, those religious convictions and that religious praxis, carried that up north with them to the Midwest. But then we also know that the West Coast and the East Coast tend to be blue. So I just thought having that kind of geographic diversity, which tends to map onto political diversity, would be really useful for this sample. 65 in-depth interviews. I recruited participants using digital platforms. So I posted flyers on social media and had the respondents reach out to me if they felt they met the qualifications. I opened it up for denominational diversity as well. So I just had them, as long as they self-defined as Christian. Again, that was a decision that was made based off reading the sociology literature that made me think nobody was going to church anymore. So I wanted to make the requirement with regards to Christianity very broad, but I still ended up getting primarily participants who go to church. Yeah, I asked them, I had a series of open-ended questions, and I kind of had a conversation with them and let them tell me about their faith journeys. And then I asked them some specific questions about their current religious expression and embodiment, their perceptions about the politicization of Christianity and how they engage that in this current moment, as well as questions about kind of their racial identity and how they kind of see their Christianity as separate and or distinct from white Christianity, if at all. So yeah, it was really great conversations. Many of them were over 2 hours, again, confirming that people have very deep thoughts about their faith. It's not something that was just put on them as a child and they stopped thinking about. They have very critical thoughts about it. And it seems like it's a great time for more scholars to be engaging these communities and giving them the space to talk about that.
In my high school classes that I teach, I'm always showing my students the updated like Pew data on things like religious nuns and the future trends and projections in American religious practices. I just love those things and showing students like the way that things ebb and flow over time. What did you find with regards to the nuns and the duns in your study?
I had to read and familiarize myself with that literature and those statistics. And shout out to Pew, because they're constantly giving us great data to think about these things, updated data. And so we're so grateful for the work that they do. And so, yeah, I needed to be familiar with that, again, as I was situating my study in ongoing scholarly conversations. I did have some people reach out who would say, like, well, this is kind of how my faith is. Would you be willing to talk to me? So, for example, I had one participant who said, well, I identify as a Christian witch. Would you still be interested in talking to me? And I said, well, yes, I would.
Heck yeah.
Because I mean, she still identified as Christian, and I was really fascinated to hear about her story and her journey. So obviously, by the nature of my study, the demographics that I was looking for the participants in my study, I didn't get a lot of people reaching out who would identify as a dun or a nun. Well, yeah, because again, the way that some of those quantitative studies who define nuns and duns are kind of like they're leaving the faith in a way. And this is where some scholars who look at like younger Black Christians are curious about engaging these conversations, because we do think that there's a racial distinction between identifying as a nun or a dun, where we're kind of I've talked to some people at conferences about this, and we're kind of on the same page that when Black people say they're done with the church or that the church is dead, that doesn't necessarily mean they now identify as atheists. They have no faith. They don't believe in a God figure. Whereas that seems to be the interpretation for non-Black or particularly white religious communities, that when they're saying, oh, there's this increase in nuns, there's this increase in duns, it's that these generations no longer really consider themselves within the faith community broadly and are probably going to pass that down to their children. So those projections are that, like, while those trends are increasing now, it's going to have like exponential effects on the rates of religiosity in society later, because again, we do know the family becomes a prominent institution for which religion is passed down to future generations. So I do think there's some racialization like within those processes. And again, I didn't explore much. I don't explore Black nuns or duns because I really was looking at those who identify as Christian, who actively engage in their faith, whether that's in or outside of a church. It just so happened that I ended up with a sample that primarily did engage with their faith in a church. So yeah.
Gotcha. That's totally cool. So you mentioned in the article that there are some sociocultural constants across generations in relation to the Black church, and I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about what some of those constants are across generations.
Yeah. So again, when I came up with, I tried to identify what were some of the most salient functions of the Black church
Yeah.
historically, and then I tried to set up this kind of quasi experimental design to see if my interview data had any evidence that some of those functions were still present in contemporary society for young Black Christians. So again, one of the things that the Black church was known for is being a cultural institution in which Black culture was birthed and cultivated within the community that was fostered through the Black church. And so, again, this is where we see some of the music, some of the dancing, some of the traditions like call and response. Just like last year, the name is escaping me, but there was a young politician in Tennessee, and there were some things, some kind of issues going on with the Tennessee legislation, and it seemed like he was getting pushed out or something. And anyways, he was giving lots of public speeches, and he ended up, I think he actually is a minister, so that was part of the conversation. But he spoke, even when he was just doing short little news clips, as if he was preaching a sermon, right? And so it was funny because there was all of this rhetorical analysis in the news, like, is this fake? Is he just doing this to like pull on the heartstrings of Black America, which again generally has deep roots connected to the church? Or is this really kind of how he talks, how he presents himself? And again, he's a trained and ordained minister. And so again, we see these types of rhetorical devices being established, and the reasons why they resonate with communities is because they have connections to the Black church. So again, these are just some brief examples of the cultural relevance of the Black church. So again, as I was looking through and analyzing the interview data and the conversations that I had with Black Christian Millennials, sociocultural was one of the functions that I argued, persists over time. And that's because, I had evidence that participants still went to the church for various activities. I had one participant who shared how, the church still made itself available during local Black Lives Matter uprisings in their city. And so and this was a good sample to ask this question to, because most of them did say they went to church and they had a home church. They were distinctly equipped to discuss how the Black church was still producing culture, fostering culture, and supporting community needs.
Gotcha. So you just mentioned that the church was present in some of like the uprisings and things like that. Is that one of the ways the church has emerged as a socio-emotional function within the community as well? Because I know that you write about some of those socio-emotional emergences coming out in the church's functions too.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. This one was really fascinating to me. And in part because, I think there's just some generational conventions and interests that have shifted because, don't get me wrong, the Black church historically was referred to as a space of refuge from hostile, racist, broader American society. So in some ways, you could talk about it being an emotional like offering socio-emotional support. But that was more at like a community-wide level rather than what my participants were talking about, which is why I argue this was an emerging function, was they literally talked about going to church every Sunday as therapy. It was free therapy. When they're listening to these sermons from their pastors, when they're taking notes, when they're listening to these podcasts, or they're listening to their worship music, it situates and orients their mind and prepares them for the week. And to me, that's a very different type of socio-emotional support than again, the Black church as an institution and physical building being a literal space of refuge away from white racist society. Don't get me wrong, I do think that those both fall under the broader category of emotional support, but the reason why I listed this as an emerging function is because I just didn't see literature that suggested that people were clinging to their religious praxis as a supplement to their mental health. And that's what the Black Christian Millennials I spoke to discussed. So again, I remember one of my participants, and I think I used this quote in this story in the article, talked about just going through some financial hard times, just some difficult times, was very overwhelmed. The church that he was attending was far away. The city he lived in didn't have public transportation. And he was having some car issues and he missed church and he literally sobbed. Like missing church, like his church was so pivotal to his well-being at that time in his life that like the idea, the fact that he had to miss church and he couldn't get his weekly refill, if you will, with the Holy Spirit and the affirming words that he received from his pastor, led him to tears. So again, it was really interesting to hear the participants talk about their engagement with their church communities in this way, because I don't think people realize it. Again, it's funny. Oftentimes people who, again, don't really understand or maybe haven't had their own direct experiences with being an active member in a church, they don't understand. They think people are kind of just minions, just going kind of blindly. But, so I think that this research becomes really interesting because, it gives these Black Christian millennials the capacity to articulate for themselves why I get up every Sunday and maybe Wednesday and maybe Saturday if I'm involved in a ministry or two too, and go to church, or why I give my money, or why I support this pastor or this leader. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, it doesn't sound to me like the Black church is dead or dying. Does it sound like that to you?
It doesn't. And so that's why the actual argument of the article is that instead of these debates about whether or not the Black church is dead or dying, we should just think of it as evolving, because
Yep.
at the end of the day, it's a social institution. And so just like this study shows, it's going to continue to adapt to meet the distinct needs of the Black community, or particularly the factions of the Black community that are willing to engage it. And so I try to introduce this concept called religious resilience to say that the Black church, like all forms of religion and churches and institutions, it's a social construction. And so therefore it's constantly adapting to the needs of the community. It's constantly shifting across time, space, and social location. And we just need to be attuned to that. And we really should be fascinated at why these institutions continue to be resilient, even in the face of what some might objectively say are harms or critiques. So I even briefly mentioned, I think I just gave a brief example because at the time I was finishing up this study, all of the documentaries and docuseries about the Hillsong debacle was happening. And so I'm saying, look at Hillsong. Like that's a massive religious institution with far-reaching implications and influence. And even with all of this stuff coming out, horrific, horrible things about the origins of it, just behaviors and ideologies embedded within it, exploitation, just anything you could think of. Again, really not that, as sociologically, really not that surprising if you juxtapose it to any other major institution in society. But of course, we know that religious institutions get held to a different standard because they presumably are aligning themselves with the values of their faith, which would say they wouldn't be engaging in these problematic behaviors and perpetuating these problematic ideologies. But nonetheless, Hillsong, sure, it's going to see some declines. Sure, there are many people who walked away from that institution and some even from their faith because they were so close to the harm. But we should be really fascinated at the ways that it's going to kind of roll through that season. And so that's why I think the religious resilience concept becomes really interesting. The Black church is the same way. The Black church, we cannot literally say the Black church is dead. There are thousands of Black churches that meet every Sunday and Wednesday and are offering all types of supports to the community, whether that's food banks or, again, still offering mutual aid, things like that. But we should talk about, again, how it's going to continue to adapt itself and to manifest itself. So COVID became a really interesting case of this, when many churches who weren't already up to date on their tech and their digital footprint scrambled to get that infrastructure ready to go. So that's just a really clear example of how, something that theoretically could have and should have taken the weak and dying Black church all the way out, they had to adapt, they had to pivot. So yeah, that's what this concept of religious resilience is doing. It's pushing us to think of the ways that these religious institutions and organizations evolve as a result of the social context that they're in to meet the needs of their congregants and to the community.
Amazing. Well, I love hearing about the trends and the evolution and what you're noticing in your work, because I love it when we can talk about right now with things that we can see in front of our faces in the communities that we all live in and share together today. So I love hearing about what's going on and what you're noticing in your work. And as a member of the Sacred Rights Public Scholarship cohort, I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about why you think it's important for scholars like you to get your work out into the public sphere beyond just like the ivory tower, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I think that religion, like many of the concepts we study in sociology, religion is one of those things that everyone thinks they're an expert in. And so they think it doesn't deserve critical study, or that it has, like, theories and concepts that can help us understand things. And it's just not true. Religion is extremely complex, and it does inform all of us in either explicit or implicit ways. And so I think that despite the fact that there are many academics who are trying to kind of perpetuate this narrative that it's becoming insignificant, and that's just because it's probably insignificant within this, like, upper middle class academic demographic. But we need to be really intentional about the ways that the demographics of the academy do not reflect the demographics and lifestyles of the world. And so public scholarship on religion becomes really important in bridging that gap, because there are a lot of people in society across the globe who are religious or hold some kind of faith or spirituality praxis, where our research can be really useful to them for making sense of their own lived experiences and also how to engage with and interact with others. And so that's what I've enjoyed so much about the Sacred Rights program, is even just being a part of this summer cohort and learning about the great work that my other cohort mates are doing. It's like, this work is important. We have important things to say, and there are a lot of communities who are eager to listen to and engage with the work that we're doing.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Shaonta Allen, I have loved learning about your work and the religious resilience in the Black church and your commitment to public scholarship. I loved reading your piece as The Black Church Dead, Religious Resilience in the Contemporary Functions of Black Christianity. Do you have a goal in mind for the book publication date that you're shooting for?
I'm in the early stages right now. I have a couple of presses that are interested in the project, and so I'm not actually in a position to give a date just yet, because I'm still kind of in the early stages. But I do have some other articles that are related to this work as well that are kind of in progress, and hope to have those out in the next year or so. But yes, be on the lookout for my book about Black Christian millennials and how they are holding strong to their faith within this woke socio-political climate.
Where can people find you if they want to get in touch and follow along with what you're doing?
Yeah, so you can find me clearly on my Dartmouth website. You can see kind of the courses that I'm teaching there and my most recent publications. You also can find me on my personal website, which is www.shaontathesociologist.com. I also use that handle with my Facebook page and my Instagram page. So again, those are both at Shaonta the Sociologist. And then I'm also pretty active on Twitter, and my Twitter handle, or X handle, is it's a shortened version of Black Sociologist with Questions That Need Answers. And so it's actually BLK Soch with QTNA. So the handle is a bunch of random letters. But if you just search my name, you will find me as well on Twitter /X. And I also have a YouTube page under Shaonta the Sociologist, where I previously was hosting some scholarly conversations, promoting some scholarly books that are related to my interests. And I have a vlog called The Altar Call Out, where I'm kind of looking at issues related to race, religion, and pop culture in the media. I've taken a little break, but I will plan to be posting again on the vlog on YouTube, Shaonta the Sociologist, in the upcoming year. So definitely check that out as well.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Shaonta Allen, thank you so much for joining me on Classical Ideas. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.